Whatever happened to the gospel? I ask that question. Have you ever asked that question? The Apostle Paul put it like this in Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. First for the Jew, then for the Gentile. You see, the gospel is what enables you to get to heaven. That is, if you believe this gospel. What I'm dealing with today is, without question, the most important subject there is. Because how one responds to the gospel of Jesus Christ determines whether he goes to heaven or hell when he or she dies. Martin Luther is often quoted as saying, I expect 3 surprises when I get to heaven. We're talking about what Martin Luther, the German reformer, who turned the world upside down in the 16th century by his rediscovery of justification by faith alone. He's often quoted as saying, 3 surprises. 1, Luther says, there will be people in heaven that I did not expect to be there. Second, there will be people not present in heaven that I was sure would be there. And then, said Luther, the greatest surprise of all, that I'm there myself. Well, now, I want to give a talk today on this subject, whatever happened to the gospel, and I do so to show what the New Testament means by the gospel and how you can be sure you will go to heaven when you die. Well, let me give my definition of the true gospel. The gospel is the good news that you will go to heaven when you die and not to hell by transferring your trust in your good works to what Jesus Christ, the Son of God, did for you on the cross. You know, I want to commend people throughout the world most warmly, various people in various parts of the world, especially in Britain and America, where I've got many friends who faithfully uphold and preach the historic gospel of Jesus Christ. This would include those in the public ministry, but equally those lay people who have little or no profile in the church. And so I think of people like that. I thank God for anyone and everyone who is unashamed of the pure gospel of Jesus Christ, whether they are in pulpits preaching to thousands or giving out pamphlets in the streets. Well, if you're like me, you will be surprised to learn that the question, whatever happened to the gospel, became relevant before the end of the first century of Christianity, even while the Apostle John was still alive. However, it is sad but true that few were asking that question then. Here's what happened. The gospel was brushed to one side and no one seemed to notice it. I'm talking about toward the end of the first century, 2,000 years ago. And proof of this is the letter of Jesus to the church of Ephesus from the throne of God. It's in Revelation chapter 2, written at some time, we don't know the exact date, between 70 AD and 100 AD. 2,000 years after that, the question now today becomes more relevant than ever, especially, and I don't mean to be unfair, but when you watch some religious programs on television today, I would say that at least 90% of what we watch on religious television focuses on almost everything but the gospel. For example, the prosperity gospel, the health and wealth gospel, the name and claim it gospel. God will make you prosperous if you support a particular ministry. or there is what we will come to see, we call it hyper grace teaching. Or there's the view God wants everybody healed. Or there's the political gospel. Or the feel-good gospel. I'm sorry, but the common denominator of religious television today is mostly about money. And so I ask the question, whatever happened to the gospel? You see, the gospel is free. The prosperity gospel has eclipsed the gospel of Jesus Christ in many religious television networks. And the emphasis today, for example, on worship and singing, has done virtually the same thing in many churches when you consider how little time is given to preaching in some places, not to mention the shallow content of so many songs being written today. And there is what is being called hyper grace teaching. The notion that believers do not need to confess their sins to God, that view has elbowed its way into many churches. It has divided the people of God in many parts of the world, and in some cases, even ruined marriages. Well, what about the political gospel? Whether you call it that or not, it relegates the gospel to one side in order to stress how crucial it is that you vote for a particular party or candidate. And then there is the theology of open theism. Now, that's a term that maybe you've not heard of, and I'm going to talk about that in this series of talks on whatever happened to the gospel. But what is known as open theism, that God is open, He doesn't know the future. He looks to us to help Him decide what to do next. Well, that kind of teaching, would you believe, has been the doctrinal foundation of many platforms, even if some don't know that term. Well, furthermore, I have to tell you, many people in charismatic churches flock to hear a rhema word, a word of knowledge, or personal prophecy, but sometimes show no interest in the real reason God sent His Son into the world to die on the cross. So, name it and claim it teaching, that's what it's called by some. Name it and claim it. Suggests you can have anything you ask for. Just name what you want and claim that God will give it to you. So the health and wealth gospel purports that God wants everybody to be well off financially and healed. And if one is not healed, it's down to one's lack of faith. Really? In addition to these concerns, have you ever thought about the absence of preaching and teaching on the subject of hell and eternal punishment? Have you become concerned about the lack of the fear of God in the church and in society? Have you wondered if there might be a correlation between the absence of the fear of God and the absence of belief in eternal punishment? Well, if this were not enough to concern us, there's been an ever-growing acceptance of universalism in the church today, the view that all will be saved and none will be lost. Well, that teaching renders the gospel useless. Why preach if all will be saved? And yet, I have to tell you, I've also been worried about a large number of what we might call word churches, but also spirit churches. There are churches that emphasize theology, doctrine, the Bible, word churches, and then there are those that emphasize power of the Holy Spirit, like in the book of Acts. So whether in Britain or in America, and some of these people have become more excited about politics than the gospel. And there are those who feel that they have a mandate to support certain candidates owing to their conservative views. I just wish they were as excited about the gospel as they were over who gets elected to a political office. Right or left, rightly or wrongly, it seems to me that the gospel has been pushed behind the door in order for people to express their political views. It somehow does not seem right to me to be more excited about political and social issues than the pure, simple, undiluted gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, the true gospel, in my view, has been largely ignored in many historic Protestant churches in America, for example, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopal, some taking out any reference to the blood of Christ from the traditional hymns. At the same time, some focus in some word churches. They stress sanctification as the only grounds for assurance of salvation, robbing the gospel of its uniqueness. And that said, it is my own observation that almost wherever I go nowadays, a shocking percentage of people in all denominations, whether word or spirit churches, lack assurance of their own salvation simply because they don't know the gospel. Several years ago, I was invited by the late John Wimber to have dinner with him in London. He and I were good friends. I heard him preach in Royal Albert Hall and enjoyed his message. And to be candid with you, I don't often get words for people. But I was pretty sure I had a word for John. And I was troubled about one thing and told him this. And I put it like this. You say, John, that the reformers gave us the word in the 16th century, but in the 20th century, that's when it was that I had this conversation with him, we're to do the works. 16th century, the word, 20th century, the works. And that is what he taught. John agreed that this is what he said, and that his ministry now was to teach people to do the works. We've got the word 400 years ago. Now we're to do the works, which he meant, meaning largely praying for people to be healed. I said to him, John, you are teaching pharaohs that knew not Joseph. It's put that way in Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. There came a Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. You are assuming that the people you are teaching know the word. Just because we got it 400 years ago, I said, John, these people you are teaching today to do the works don't have a clue what Martin Luther gave to the world in the 16th century. So how can you teach people to do the works when they don't actually know the word? And that's what I put to my friend, the late John Wimber. You know what happened? He put his knife and fork down. We were having a meal together, and then put both his index fingers in the middle of his chest and said to me, RT, you have touched the very vortex of my thinking right now. I fully accept your word. That's what he said to me. Whether this made any difference in his ministry after that, I don't know. I can only say we were good friends. He spent 2 hours with me at Westminster Chapel just a few weeks before he went to heaven. All right. The gospel, as I defined it earlier in this talk, will continue to be mentioned in this series of talks because I hope to be able to do this for a few weeks. It's because I believe that the true gospel has passed behind a cloud throughout the world. by which I mean I refer to the historic gospel as introduced by Jesus, filled out by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and articulated by the reformers of the 16th century. Well, my understanding of the gospel has been refined over the past 60 years or more. And as we will see over these coming weeks, someone like John Calvin built his understanding of the gospel on Martin Luther's teaching of justification by faith alone, not contradicting but making clearer what the Apostle Paul and Martin Luther taught. I suspect that Luther was right in his speculation. I think many of us may be surprised to see people in heaven we assumed were not fit for heaven. Could this be because we set a standard of fitness that is different from what the Lord Himself requires? And yet, if we should miss seeing a friend or a loved one in heaven, if this could be a good question we should ask, I could only conclude that we will be kept from feeling any pain. I wouldn't think anybody should worry. God's not going to let you have pain if you don't see people in heaven you thought would be there, because God promised that He will wipe away all tears from the eyes of those that enter the New Jerusalem, and that there will be no pain. Revelation chapter 21, verse 4. So I don't think God would let that question enter our minds in heaven. Well, now, the Apostle Paul's statement is worth remembering as you listen to my talk today, and if you're able to join us over the next several weeks. He said, quote, "Judge nothing before the appointed time. Wait till the Lord comes. He will bring to light what is hidden in darkness and will expose the motives of men's hearts. At that time, each will receive his praise from God." He said that in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 5. Well, now, I want to talk about rediscovering the true gospel. The Apostle Paul said, writing to the Galatians, quote, "I am astonished," he says to the Galatians, "that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all." Well, evidently some people are throwing you into confusion, says Paul, and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. You can read that in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Here's a little story that has come out of Germany that I think is kind of funny and interesting. It goes like this. A drunken man wandered around in a German village at 2 o'clock in the morning, and he made his way to the parish church and walked in. He began climbing the stairs that led to the top of the belfry, and he suddenly tripped. He grabbed a rope as he fell. It was the rope that rang the bell. Trying to save his life, he held on to the rope, which began going up and down, and the bell began to ring. Lights went on throughout the village. A bell ringing in the middle of the night meant that something significant was happening, and the whole village was awakened, and people made their way to the church, only to find the drunken man holding on to the bell to save his life. Well, I think that that story fits with what happened to a man by the name of Martin Luther. Now, not long ago, the whole world recognized the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's rediscovery of the gospel when he nailed the 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door in Germany. It was October 31st, 1517. Well, it's my view that Martin Luther's rediscovery was the Apostle Paul's teaching of justification by faith alone, and it woke up not only Germany, but the whole of Europe. Well, Martin Luther didn't intend to wake up the world. He was trying to save his own soul. That is all it was. I don't know how much you know about Martin Luther. I'd like to take just a word, take a moment to give you a word about him. He was the son of a coal miner. He was born November 10th, 1483 in Eisleben, Saxony, Germany. To please his father, he entered law school in the University of Erfurt, but eventually dropped out, complaining that law represented uncertainty. He sought assurance about life and was drawn to theology and philosophy. His tutors taught him to be suspicious even of the greatest thinkers and to test everything by experience. Well, the result was that Martin Luther became disillusioned with philosophy. It taught him nothing about loving God, which had become very important to him. And he became convinced that he could know God only by revelation and reading the Holy Scriptures. Well, at the age of 21, Luther was riding on horseback, 2nd of July, 1505, riding on horseback during a thunderstorm. Lightning struck very close to him. Being terrified of death and divine judgment, Luther cried out, "Help me, Saint Anne, and I will become a monk." Saint Anne was the patron saint of coal miners. Well, Martin Luther explained this to his father, that he was going to have to keep that vow. His father said, "Oh, you don't need to keep that vow. You just did it when you were nervous." But Luther said, "No, I made a vow to God." And at this point, he had to separate from his father in the sense that he's not going to be able to please his father now. 2 weeks later, he became an Augustinian monk. And Martin Luther devoted himself to fasting, long hours of prayer and confession, and he was so conscientious that he would return to confession in an hour after having just confessed to a priest. He thought of one more sin. He didn't confess. And you know, the priests who heard his confession dreaded to see him coming so often that they said, "Look here, somebody else take him this time." Luther is just too conscientious. Well, in 1507, Luther was ordained to the priesthood. In 1508, he was invited to teach theology at the University of Wittenberg. And then in 1512, he was awarded the Doctor of Theology. And from then on, he's Dr. Martin Luther. However, Luther became increasingly troubled about the spiritual conditions of the church, and he wondered about the rightness and biblical soundness of the sale of indulgences, paying for remission of temporal punishment due to sin, the money going to build St. Peter's in Rome. It was suggested that he himself should visit Rome. His colleagues felt that he needed a break from his studies, and if you, Luther, saw the grandeur of Rome, you would get encouraged. Luther went to Rome, where he climbed the Scala Sancta, the holy stairs. By the way, I did this too. Some years ago, I myself, when I was in Rome a few years ago, I climbed the holy stairs because I knew Luther did it. I wonder what it would seem like, especially recalling that Luther said to himself, when he reached the top of the stairs, he said, "Who knows if this is true?" So these stairs had been built so that one could climb each step on their knees. And it takes several minutes to do this on your knees. Each step allegedly guaranteed to give you many years out of purgatory. And so, as I said, when Luther reached the top of the stairs, he asked himself, "Who knows whether this be true?" He also became disillusioned when he learned about the immorality of so many priests there. Being in Rome did not change his concerns, but only heightened them. He later reported, "I went to Rome smelling of onions. I came back smelling of garlic." Luther had what is known as a tower experience. At some point between 1513 and 1517, when he was reading the Psalms, Romans, and Galatians, he had what he would call a tower experience. No one seems to know the exact date, but we know it was while studying certain Psalms, especially Psalm 32, Psalm 118, Romans and Galatians, where Luther crossed over from doubt to full assurance of faith. As for Psalm 118, Luther said, I call it my own. And he became drawn particularly to Romans chapter 1, verse 17. The just shall live by faith, which is a quotation from Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 11:13. Luther's tower experience came when he became convinced that faith alone, apart from good works, satisfied, these are his words, the passive justice of God. By this, Luther means that he did not have to act to satisfy God's justice. God is satisfied not by our having to perform works, but that faith alone satisfied God's justice. Active justice would mean that we do things to get satisfaction. Passive justice meant God got satisfaction by our doing nothing. It's when God sees our faith. Luther said it is a passive justice by which a merciful God justifies us by faith alone. Faith without works, therefore, means justification by faith alone. Well, when Luther began to see the implications of this insight, he became more and more bold and confident. Well, I have to bring this particular talk to a close. What I'm showing is that Martin Luther asked, whatever happened to the gospel 500 years ago? I'm asking it today. The difference was in those days, Luther was showing how to know you're saved. The issue today, do people need to be saved? Well, I think we need another Reformation, and I pray that it will come soon, and it will be a rediscovery of the same gospel. It turned the world upside down then. It will do it again, and may God hasten the day.